Did the grand jury make the right decision in 1999? That's the first question I have for you, James. What do you say to that?
Well, I think it shows that they considered the same evidence that Boulder police investigators were considering at the time that they were attempting to identify the perpetrator in this crime. And based upon their review and the new release of the documents about the indictments, it seems to me that they believed the family was involved in some fashion and decided to indict on those two charges that were considered.
All right. So we know those two charges, child abuse resulting in death and accessory to the crime. What evidence was missing that kept the DA from going forward?
Well, that's a very complicated question. I think there could have been a lot of things that could be considered missing from the DA's perspective to be able to bring them to a threshold of prosecuting beyond a reasonable doubt. I think there's been a lot of discussion about the threshold for indictment being the same as probable cause as an officer would have for arresting someone, but the prosecutor's office has a higher standard when they decide to prosecute someone for an offense.
Well, I know the attorney for John Ramsey issued the following statement. I want to read that to you. Public release of the allegations of an unprosecuted indictment only serves to further defame him and his late wife. So a lot of people are saying, why release these documents now? Is it fair?
Well, I think it's an important piece of the historical history of this investigation. The grand jury considered evidence and apparently did vote to indict on two specific charges. The prosecuting attorney decided not to file charges, but the record stands that the foreman and the grand jury felt that there were sufficient grounds to arrest or at least charge, and that's why they signed the indictments at the time back in 1999.
Okay, so what were in the other documents, and why not release all of them at this point?
That's a question I think that everyone is asking. Alex Hunter at the time could have indicated that the grand jury did find true bills on two specific charges. He chose not to do so for whatever reason. And then he could have also indicated that while the grand jury did indict, that perhaps he didn't feel there were still sufficient grounds for him to prosecute.
You know, the count 7 from this grand jury basically said that they knew who killed her but covered it up. They looked at, I know this grand jury looked at 30,000 pieces of evidence, dozens of witnesses over 13 months. Did you see any evidence of a cover-up in what you uncovered?
I think it's extremely unlikely that an intruder was involved in this situation. And what's frustrating for me is that the DNA evidence continues to be proffered as proof that an intruder was involved. The fact
So
of the matter
who do you
is,
think was involved, James?
I do not think an intruder was involved. There was more than one sample of DNA that was discovered over the course of this investigation. The touch DNA that was done late in 2008 and 2009 revealed additional unknown, unidentified male samples of DNA on the implements used in the murder of John Benet. If you look at the totality of those circumstances, there are 6 unidentified samples of DNA, trace amounts.
So do you think the parents are incriminated in this case based on all the evidence you've seen?
I believe a strong look was warranted by investigating the family as a possible...
Okay, but when you say investigating the family, do you mean specifically the parents or do you mean someone else in the family?
There were 3 people in the home that evening. I think investigators needed to look at all 3 of them. Okay.
Do you think, boy, at this point, do you think this case is ever going to be solved, that we're ever going to know?
It's very unlikely unless there's a confession or someone else comes forward that has information that's been shared with them. There is one other possible lead that I proposed to the Boulder Police Department and the DA's office over the course of writing Foreign Faction, and that was another grand jury inquiry and calling Burke Ramsey to the stand in that event. Would anything come of that? I couldn't say for certain, but he turned efforts away from investigators to interview him back in 2009, and a grand jury might be another opportunity to see if they could get that interview.
Okay, and again, who is it that you would like to hear them interview?
Burke Ramsey.
And Burke is?
Burke is the son who was
son.
in the home at the time of the homicide.
The 13-year-old. Did you interview Burke yourself?
No, I did not interview him. Boulder police attempted to interview him after Chief Beckner called a cold case task force meeting to review all the circumstances before he took the case back from the DA's office. Those efforts to speak to him, he is now an adult, were not granted, and so that's one additional possible lead I think that could be followed up on.
Okay, so this is a cold case, which means it's not closed, it's still open, but what kind of efforts are being made to close it at this point? Has opening up these documents publicly renewed any sort of effort?
I think they renew an interest. I don't think that they add to any effort for prosecution. You know, the grand jury found probable cause on 2 different counts back in 1999. The DA's office chose not to prosecute at the time, so that did not necessarily mean that Stan Garnett can come in and prosecute now. The statute of limitations has run on those offenses.